Thank you for having us. We really appreciate talking to League of Women Voters who we have partnered on a number of issues throughout the years. I'm Jasmine Gripper. I'm the Executive Director of AQE. I have a background in teaching, primarily elementary school. I spent about 5 years in the classroom teaching first grade before I transitioned into advocacy work, where I found a great home at AQE, which was a combine of my love of education and a love of community organizing. And it's been a pleasure to work with our team. We are now about 10 full-time staff members. We're all female, majority women of color. And we're working statewide to advance racial justice in our public schools through both a statewide strategy as well as a local strategy in key communities like Buffalo, Rochester, Albany, Utica, Kingston, New York City, and in a few of the districts in Long Island like Hempstead. And I'll pass it to my colleague, Marina.
Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. As Ellen said already, I'm Marina Marco-O'Malley. I'm the Policy and Operations Director for AQE. Been with the AQE for about 14 years. And before that, I was also an early childhood teacher. I taught for 2 years in kindergarten and actually second grade. And then I started teaching as an adjunct at the University at Albany, the Department of Communication, before I came to AQE, where not only did I find a home, but I also grew roots in Albany, got married, have my kids here who go to public school here in the city of Albany. So, and I'm also Ellen's neighbor, just my regular route. So excited to be here with you all today. And we do see, I have to shout out. I see a person, I see Ina here who
Ina from Buffalo?
Oh, wow, they got a mouth to say, why you do that?
We go way back, right, Ina?
That's right. Hello.
It's good to have you here with us, Ina. Ina has been on the front lines with us in Buffalo and here in Albany when necessary, fighting for our children in our schools. So glad to have her here. So we have a presentation in store for you. We're going to share a little bit about the history of the school funding fight, particularly here in New York. And we're going to talk about, school governance, as well as talk about a little of the more controversial issues that are happening in education right now, like the attacks on critical race theory, and some tools that folks can have access to stand up and fight back against those attacks, which are not just about critical race theory, but actually an attack on our democracy. And so, Marina, you want to kick us off?
Yeah. Everybody can see my screen?
We can.
Perfect. So, most of our advocacy, when we organize people, we organize them to build power, but also to affect the budget fight here in Albany that's currently underway. As it was said earlier, we are a coalition of community organizing groups. We were founded in 2000 when the Campaign for Fiscal Equity lawsuit was actually getting to be about 7 years old. It had gone through multiple levels of court, and the organizers of Citizen Action and then Acorn decided that we needed an additional push. We needed the push to organize parents and give a legislative resolution to the lawsuit. Well, that took a little bit of time. It took 2 walks by Senator Robert Jackson, parent, and Senator Robert Jackson from New York City to Albany to get that done. But last year, we did it. In 2020, we won billions from federal government, and in actually 2021, that was last year, we were able to win a 3-year phase-in of the remainder, $4.2 billion, that's with a B, of foundation aid, which is a classroom operating aid, basically. And it prioritizes high needs districts, districts like Albany, like New York City, like Buffalo, like Rochester and Utica. But so it was quite the journey to get there.
Marina, can I just, there might be some people on this call who are not familiar with the campaign for fiscal equity because the lawsuit started so many years ago. And it took such a long time to get us where we are. So can you just give a little like thumbnail sketch of that? Just in case. Thank you.
Go ahead, Jen.
I'll do a brief summary of the lawsuit. So the lawsuit started in, oh my gosh, what, 2009? New York City parents.
A lawsuit?
Yeah.
1993.
1993. Thank you. Wow. New York City parents sued the state, and it was in response to just realizing that their schools did not have enough resources and that the state wasn't providing enough for New York City schools to meet the needs of our children. And that happened in a district in Washington Heights in New York City. And the parent at the time who was on the New York City version of a school board was Robert Jackson, who is now a state senator in Washington Heights. So just think about the long journey from him to be a parent, school board, city council member, and now state senator. Parents sued the state, and essentially the state sided with parents. It said the court sided with the parents and said New York State was violating students' constitutional rights to a sound basic education by underfunding our public schools. And the courts ordered the state to enact a remedy that was statewide. And hence the legislature created the foundation aid formula, which was an equitable school formula to distribute aid, as opposed to what was happening in New York, which was, New York was notorious for using like 14 different formulas in 1 year to divvy up school aid based on politics, right? Based on you have a tough election this year, so you should get more school aid, not based on need. And so as a result of the CFE lawsuit, many years in the courts, appeal after appeal, finally parents won, and the state was committed to funding this formula. Unfortunately, after 2 years of the first phase-in, the whole world hit a financial crisis, including New York and Wall Street being devastated, and literally the state clawed back all of that money from our schools. So after winning a commitment for billions of dollars of increase, the state took back all that money. They created a cutting formula. And we had been fighting since to get the state back to recommitting to fully funding our schools. And like Marina said, just last year, we finally got the state to commit to a 3-year phase-in. Year 1, we got the money. Year 2, we're in the state budget. We're on track to get the money. And we're not going to take for granted that year 3 is going to happen. We're going to continue our advocacy to make sure the state does not renege on its promise again, and we get the year 3 of funding. So
that's right.
That's the bridge version. Sorry, Marina, if I took some of the stuff you were going to say.
It's okay. Totally fine. So that's where we are right now. This is year 2, and we have about $1.6 billion in foundation aid coming for the school year 2022-23. So in our schools, what are some issues increased funding can help with? So instead of actually coming up with answers on our own, we asked parents, and lo and behold, they had some answers for us. So decreased class sizes, more staff, school support, mental health support. Those are the kinds of things that local school districts can implement with state funding. And that is definitely one of the ways that people in different school districts can affect the process in the local school budgets. So that is a question that we can put to you all. How do you think? What other issues do you might know that increased funding can help address? This is a question that you all can answer.
Folks can just come off of mute and chime in.
perhaps English as a second language classes to make classes smaller, special education needs, diversity in hiring, after school programs.
Yes to all of these. All of this. So does anyone else have an answer? Because I can't see you all, but if not, I'll move to this slide. This other question of, you know, we've asked parents this question: how has your school felt the impact of the increased funding? And not many people actually were able to answer that, and there's a reason for it. Oops, here's the reasons why. Most people don't know that this money comes to their state, to the school district. So there's a lack of accountability. If people don't know what is coming to their district, then they can't actually ask about it and see if it's implemented correctly or if it's going to the right things. Sometimes funds are being diverted towards privatization. If there are any of you here in Albany, you might know that of the school funding we get from the state, a little bit, almost 40 million goes to our local charter schools here. And some of them are part of chains, some of them are not, but they are almost all connected to a management organization that charges them for different things. That's one way that we can conceptualize privatization. So that's some of the reasons, and together, both at the state level and at the local level, we can and we should continue to fight to make sure that funds are being spent appropriately. Jasmine?
Yep. And so the power structure in Albany, many people know this, but just always like to name what the dynamics we're dealing with in the New York State Legislature, since for the high need school districts, the majority of funding for their schools comes from the state. And so, like Marina names, Albany, for example, Buffalo, Rochester, districts that have a low tax base, they make up their school funding in state aid, which is really important. So why we can't have a fight for education justice or education equity without actually holding New York State and its leaders accountable. And so we now have our new governor, Kathy Hochul, we have the majority leader, Andrea Stewart-Cousins in the state Senate, and we have our speaker, Carl Hastie, in the New York State Assembly. And as you can see, New York State is a Democratic trifecta at the state level, which is really new to us. And this new dynamic of power in Albany has led to some transformational changes and laws being passed in favor of equity, where we didn't quite get that when Republicans were controlling the state Senate for years. Next slide. And so I just want to name some of the current issues that we're fighting for at the state level. So one is universal childcare. So the pandemic, really elevated the need for childcare and how this was an essential service for our communities. For parents, they often could not find a childcare slot or a childcare seat in their community. When they did find childcare that was available and someone could take on their children, it is often too expensive. And on the flip side, for workers, which are mostly women and mostly women of color, we pay too low for childcare, and we actually are paying them poverty wages to childcare providers, even though, again, they're providing an essential service to our communities. And this area has been just neglected by the state due to a lack of, increased funding, a lack of strategic, upgrades to the system to integrate technology. And so we've been really fighting New York State this year, especially, and demanding a $5 billion increase in the state budget to move New York on a path to universal childcare by 2025. I will say, the Assembly and Senate one House for budget proposals came out over the weekend. And the governor initially proposed $1 billion increase for childcare, and the Senate and the Assembly are proposing about $3 billion for childcare. So not quite 5, but $3 billion will be a significant step in the right direction. We were hoping, I'll name that, we were hoping to get more money from the feds, from the Build Back Better plan, but that doesn't seem to be happening right now in Washington. But absent from federal support, New York State can do this. We are a wealthy state, and New York can invest in our children and our families. Marina mentioned a little bit about charter schools. I'm not sure how familiar people are with charter schools. They are publicly funded, privately managed. And what ends up happening is you create two parallel systems that are competing for the same pot of funding. You have your traditional public schools and your charter schools. And all of the financing for charter schools comes from the local district's budget. And so you already have—
Jasmine, if I could just interrupt, Mary Kate Owens has a question in the chat box about the funding for charter schools.
Yeah. In Albany, you said 40 million goes to charter schools. What percentage of the funding represents Albany's funding? In terms of what does the city of Albany contribute to its local schools?
Yeah, I have to actually look and see what the total budget is, but Albany is one of the districts that has a disproportionate number of students going to charter schools, and that is probably a high proportion of its budget. I think I don't know the budget the local budget off the top of my head, and this amount of money is a combination of both state and local money.
So I didn't understand, and I did not want to interrupt, but Jasmine, you suggested or said that charter schools are funded only locally, not from the state funds?
No.
The state provides some level of reimbursement for school districts for some of their expenses to charter schools, but essentially each kid that leaves the district and goes to the charter school, the school district is responsible for paying that tuition.
Okay.
So your our tax dollars pay for kids to be educated in charter schools.
Okay, thank you.
And just to name a few things that are problematic about that is that, one, you just create fiscal distress for the regular school district, right? You have a school district that's probably been underfunded for decades, right? We've been fighting for school funding, and then you really rip away resources from that district to charter schools. And it really creates fiscal distress. The other part is, like, charters doesn't always mean better. The standards around teachers and who they recruit to educate are not always the same as what's in public schools. They often have a high turnaround rate, which means people don't stay in the charter industry long. And so they don't have expert teachers oftentimes. And in terms of the push out of students or the suspensions of students, charters are notorious for pushing out students who are low performing on tests. And they overuse suspensions as a way of doing that. So for example, New York City, there was a report about the 50 schools with the highest suspension rates, and 49 of those schools were charters. And so you see the overuse of suspensions happening there. And so what we are advocating at the state level is because the state actually sets the formula for what districts have to pay to charter schools. And so we're asking the state to relook at that formula. We're also asking the state to potentially reimburse districts a bit more for the growing cost to charter schools.
And Jasmine, I guess I think another, talk a little bit about, so local people who live in the city, who vote on the school budget and who fund the local school budget have no recourse to address how that local school budget is impacted by charter schools. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct.
Right.
We have little accountability. We have little oversight about what they do with the money. And if there's a problem, really, again, the public's hands are tied in terms of democracy for any accountability with charter schools until it's the most egregious situation where they're forced to close. All right, next slide. And then the other fight we're having at the state level, AQE, along with advocates around the state, really put together a bill called Solutions, Not Suspensions. And the reason why we worked on this bill is actually a long history around the work we did in Buffalo years ago. But essentially, school districts were over-relying on harsh discipline policies like suspensions as a way to deal with classroom management. But one suspension makes a child twice as likely to drop out of school. It really sets kids up to not feel like they belong to the school community, and it often leads to too many children not finishing and leaving school completely. And so what we work to do, and many school districts, it's a long, hard work of rewriting their codes of conduct. We read some schools' codes of conduct, and they sounded like penal codes. Like, they sound like they were just from the prison, the way they were harsh and the way they talked about students. And Buffalo rewrote their code of conduct. Rochester rewrote their code of conduct. Albany did it. Some districts were forced to do it by the AG because their suspension rates were so horrible. So this is an issue we see not just in charter schools, but also in traditional public schools. The overuse of suspensions and the disproportionality in suspensions, where Black students are more likely to be suspended for longer periods of time. Students who openly identify as LGBTQ, students with disabilities, again, are disproportionately more likely to be suspended than their white counterparts. And so the bill talks about suspensions being the last resort and not the first resort, and that there are a lot of things we can do to make sure kids have the support that they need, that if they're acting out, they're probably acting out because of something else, and can we address the root cause of that before we ever get to a suspension. The other thing the bill attempts to do, I will say the main points, is like, one, we minimize the length of a long-term suspension. Right now in New York State, which is one of the few states that allows this, you can be suspended for an entire school year. That means if a kid is suspended on March 14th, 2022, if you get a year-long suspension, you can't come back until March 14th, 2023. And oftentimes, if you get a year-long suspension, you just don't come back. And so we want to limit a long-term suspension from a whole school year to maximum is 20 days. And again, that's only for the most egregious incidents. Short-term suspensions, we want to make sure that when a kid is suspended, they get access to their work, that it doesn't derail their graduation plans, that if there's a test that's given during their suspension, that they're allowed to come in a building or a district building and they can take their tests. And that students get their work in a timely manner to stay on track for graduation. And that students, they have rights and they cannot be just pushed out of school and denied access to their education. And so that's what this bill focuses on. It's something we've been, there are 700 school districts in New York State. We cannot work to refine the code of conduct in 700 schools. And the other thing the bill does is it bans the use of suspensions for our youngest kids. Suspensions, unfortunately, start as early as pre-K. They start in kindergarten. And so the bill would ban suspensions from kindergarten to third grade to say you cannot do it. Again, it doesn't violate federal law, which is like if you bring a gun to school or there's an egregious incident, but essentially that there's no reason, psychologically for brain development to suspend a kindergartner. They don't actually equate it to what they did, and that there's other ways to handle accountability for a child's behavior that does not include excluding them from the class for days on end. And so that's the bill we're hoping to move through the state legislature right now. And I'll pause because I saw the chat and I'm running for school board. Sure, definitely share mine. Yes, and then we want to make sure kids have academic support while they're suspended. Absolutely. And so those are the statewide issues we're working on, again, the state. But really, if you want to impact education, local control, local school districts is something you hear a lot. And so there's AQE strategies. You do both the statewide fight and you also do the local school fight. Some people might be new to this term, police-free schools. It's something that AQE has been on a path to supporting for a number of years. And again, our kids are being overly criminalized in schools. And we will say in the wake of the school shootings and those incidences, people have been talking about more police officers in schools. The problem with those are reactionary things that actually don't stop and don't prevent any violence in the schools. And if you really want your schools to be safe, you need to be proactive. And the thing that makes kids and schools and educators feel safe are not the presence of police. The things that make kids feel safe are feeling seen, feeling valued, feeling heard, having a place to go that's an outlet, having loving adults in the building that they can have relationships with. And so for too much, we've been investing in policing and criminalizing infrastructure, especially in Black and Brown communities in our schools. And not enough investment has been made in the supports that kids need in order to feel valued and lifted up. And so for an example, I'm just gonna name New York City because they're the most egregious in this. New York City does have the largest school district in the country, and New York City's police in schools force, which is run by the NYPD, is 5,000 officers. 5,000 officers is larger just for police in New York City schools. It is larger than the entire police force for the city of Dallas. It is larger than the entire police force for the city of Boston, for the city of Las Vegas. It is one of the largest police forces in the country, just in the New York City schools. The number 2 school district in the country is LA. Again, they're about half the size. They have about 200 officers. Not to say that 200 is okay, but it's just like, why the heck does New York City have 5,000 officers? And recent research said that was more than a number of school counselors and guidance counselors combined, right? That they had more police officers than any other thing in our schools. And so we want to divest from the policing infrastructure in our schools and instead invest in support staff for children. And this is a local fight. Rochester recently ended their contract with the police in schools. And I will say we are aware that post-pandemic, kids are coming back and people are talking about more violent incidences at schools. Again, no one's dealing with the mental health of students, and police don't do that. We really need to make sure we're doing all the things to make kids feel supported, to help them manage their emotions, to help them understand how to cope with things that make them feel uncertain. And again, it's not police officers, it's support loving staff. And I do want to also name that people forget, for undocumented students, having uniformed officers in their schools is often a thing that evokes fear and uncertainty for those families. And so just naming that when your community is over criminalized by police and your family has negative encounters with the police or those in uniform, again, police do not equate to safety. And so again, how do we remove police from our schools and instead make sure we have loving, caring adults? And we build a community of safety where kids feel seen and heard, as opposed to just feeling criminalized. Next slide. Yes, the school to prison pipeline, you're absolutely right. And we are trying to disrupt that. Accountability, Marina said earlier, our schools got billions of dollars from the federal government in response to COVID. And at the same time, the state increased aid to schools. Where did this money go? How was it spent? And what is the impact of these new resources in our schools? We really need accountability. Again, the problem here is, for AQE, is like, there are 700 school districts. How could we monitor them all? Each district is responsible for their own plan and how they're doing this. So this is where the local advocacy is absolutely important, showing up at school board meetings. Literally right now, school boards are putting out their local budgets and deciding how they're going to spend year 2 of the American Rescue Plan dollars, which they have 3 years to spend, and their year 2 increase of their foundation aid dollars, which aren't supposed to go away. They're actually only supposed to increase next year. Some of the things that parents said they want this money to be spent on: reducing class sizes, social emotional supports, specific sports for unique students like students in foster care and homeless students, and health and safety in school. Technology was another thing parents wanted to spend that money on. And so we think about like nurses in every school. We didn't have a nurse in every building before the pandemic. We still don't. Why not? And so these are some of the things we want the money to be prioritized on. There's a report on our website. We surveyed over 1,000 parents and young people about what they wanted the money to be spent on. We have to hold the districts accountable. We don't want the money, and I'll just name, because you're like, oh, well, how bad could it be? The school district in Kingston wanted to use, this money during the pandemic. It was called the Smart Schools Bond Act money that was supposed to go for technology. And when the school was closed down and kids still did not have access to laptops and learning tools at home, the school district wanted to use their money to bulletproof the floor and bulletproof the door in just the foyer of the high school. And we were just like, that is stupid. The hardening of schools is what it's called. There's even a Secret Service report around schools and school policing that says the hardening of schools, like, you know, scanners and metal detectors and bulletproofing, does not work. You need to invest in the social and emotional supports for students. They were literally going to spend millions of dollars on bulletproofing the floor instead of buying kids laptops. And it was because parents noticed it in the budget and parents stood up that they were able to stop it. And so you really need to pay attention to your local school budget fights. Pay attention to how they're spending the money. Literally, they by law, they have to publicly release those budgets, and they have to take in input from the community about the budgets before you all vote on them. So be a part of the process, hold your district accountable, and make sure there's accountability with all these new resources going to our schools. Next slide.
Jasmine, can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
What does being a part of that process look like? Because I know there the AQE money is forever money, right?
The foundation aid money, yes, it's
Right.
forever.
And the federal money is temporary money.
Correct.
So the the CFE money, the CFE money is the forever money that's coming into our district. So, you know, for Albany, it's an enormous amount of money that could really make a difference depending on where the funding goes. So what would we want to see outreach to the community look like from the school districts? Because so far, I don't think we've seen any.
So can I just speak to Albany specifically?
Yeah.
So Albany actually just started its budget process. And as a result of last year's budget, it had to have, Albany had, all school districts have to have a committee that with parents on it that participate in the budgeting process. And that was created. So Albany started with the preliminary presentation of its budget last week, and they will have multiple forums, I think mostly virtual, but some of school board meetings are also in person now. So they will present this budget as the state budget is being finalized and they know what they're getting. But they have proposed, and this is true for many school districts across the area and here in Albany. They are proposing increasing personnel for social and emotional support, so social workers and school psychologists, some more teachers around literacy specifically, and let's see if I'm forgetting something. Off the top of my head, that is what I remember. That's what I have. But those are the kinds of things that parents, community members can actually demand to be included in the school budget. So more people. Hall monitors is a big one, right? Here in Albany and in many school districts, we do not have enough hall monitors. And hall monitors are not our school staff, right? Oftentimes, especially for middle school in particular and high school, they are the first line, the first people that students turn to. So that's one. The money can go towards trainings for teachers and all school staff. Like when we talk about, and we're going to talk about it a little bit, culturally responsive sustaining education. That is a training that people have to have, right, in order to be able to respond. Or crisis de-escalation, restorative practice, those are all trainings that people have to have in order to be able to respond to students in an appropriate way. And not bring in all the punitive stuff, all the police and everything else that Jasmine just mentioned earlier. So those are buckets that money can go towards. And the federal dollars was specifically earmarked for summer school, for learning acceleration. They call it
Catching up.
Learning,
right?
Yes, learning loss, they call it, but that's not really you can't lose what you didn't learn, right? So actually it's for learning and investing in summer programs that will be engaging for kids to learn what they did not before, especially while schools were shut down. After school for the same goal.
Right.
And more social emotional supports.
Right.
Again.
Well, I think that's part of the concern, that the federal money that's coming in, that's temporary 2-year money, is supposed to be spent on these sort of crisis situations that have long-term impact on kids. So how do we sort of steer this boat of new money into mitigating learning loss and social emotional supports for kids that they're going to need for years?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So yeah, we've been we've been fighting with districts to spend the money, right? Like, some districts are afraid to hire because like, oh, we're just going to hire to have to let go. But we're like, if you can hire. A lot of districts have used it to boost their summer programs and summer learning programs on the ground, because that's a 1-year thing. Like Marina said, trainings for staff can absolutely be covered by this, which frees up some of their other money for something else. Supplies, boosting up within the classroom, those one-time costs can also happen. And we get that districts actually did spend a lot of money on the PEP equipment, on, sanitizer and air filters for their classrooms. That did eat up a lot of the money, but that doesn't mean there wasn't more for schools to still use to enhance the academics, which is what the money was supposed to be for. And so there are models of accelerated learning that districts can implement. That'll be really important. And also we want districts to focus on literacy. The literacy apps in this moment where kids miss so much time in the classroom, especially our young learners, literacy is absolutely essential. And that is beyond the usual K-3. Literacy should be happening probably from K-6 right now. That's how, like, keep in mind, like, it feels like 2 years of the pandemic, but it was 3 school years for kids. And so that was a lot of time of disrupted and interrupted learning that we absolutely need to make sure kids are catching up emotionally and socially. So we talk about social emotional learning, and that kids are catching up academically. And we can't have this permanent gap of like, the lost years, right? We need to make sure kids actually have the support to catch up to where they should be.
Right.
And I just want to name, I think someone said, having more diverse teachers is absolutely important in schools. And there's some tracks around Grow Your Own, which is you incentivize students in high school, help pay for their going to college locally, and then they come back and teach in the district. It's a really successful model around diversifying the teacher force. And so I want to talk about critical race theory. Y'all have heard this on the news in all kinds of way of it being manipulated, but essentially it's the new boogeyman that conservatives are using to say, oh my gosh, they are teaching critical race theory in your schools. They're teaching white kids to feel bad. And we're just like, who's teaching that? The all white women teacher force? Like 90% of our teachers are white women. No one is teaching that. But the idea of looking at history through a critical lens of race and racism is something we should be doing. And kids learning empathy around other fights, around racial justice issues, around fights for justice throughout history is absolutely essential. And so there's been a commitment to folks nationally that are organizing what they're calling the Teach Truth campaign. As you can see, this slide looks different. This is part of NYU's Educational Justice Center, which is where our New York City office is. But NYU, the Schott Foundation, AQE, and a few others who are national groups have been working on convening and creating materials around a commitment for school districts to teach truth. The other thing I do want to name is that the school board races have been heating up. It is where the battle is happening for our democracy. And as much as the news talks about what's happening in the South, it is happening here in New York. We have been getting calls from parents who are concerned from the suburbs of Rochester to the suburbs of Westchester to Long Island, literally across New York State. Parents are rising up and fighting back against folks who are trying to ban critical race theory in their schools, folks who are trying to ban books in schools. And I do want to say the language where states have passed bills on this, it is not just banning the teaching through a racial justice lens. They have banned the use of words like equity. They have banned the use of words like justice. It is extremely far-reaching, and it's really a rewriting of the truth and what history really reflects. And that is something we absolutely all have to stand up again as, like, it's not a Democrat or Republican value. It is a value as humans to tell the real truth of our stories and our histories and not to erase anyone. And so I have a short video that the folks from the Teach Truth campaign put together that I would like to for folks to watch. It's just a quick 2-minute video.
I'm going to just stop. Let me see what I can. Oh,
Last summer,
Can you
the
hear it?
killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery catalyzed an unprecedented worldwide mobilization, activating tens of millions of Americans of all races to demand institutional accountability and reform. As these images spread across the world, the right scrambled for a way to snuff out this transformative energy. And they think they found it by orchestrating a repressive censorship campaign. In Arizona, Idaho, Texas, Georgia, we are seeing school boards attempting to rewrite curriculums, teachers getting fired for educating their students about racial disparities, and potentially an entire generation being fed lies about American history. Make no mistake, what we are seeing now is a calculated backlash to last year's summer of racial reckoning. The right is going to try to convince you that we need to ban critical race theory, intersectionality, structural racism, implicit bias, diversity training, and the 1619 Project. But understand that this organized, well-funded, and coordinated campaign isn't an honest debate about these ideas. Most couldn't even define what these ideas are. And that's the point. They want to scare and silence our society back to colorblind submission, where George Floyd and Black people's killability is just a natural, everyday feature of American life, unproblematic, unchangeable, and disconnected from the history of anti-Black racism. From the criminalization of abolitionist literature to the McCarthy-era witch hunts, we've seen the government respond to liberatory movements through the repression of anti-racist ideas time and time again. If you are concerned about these efforts to censor history, to muzzle anti-racist speech, to expand voter suppression, and to criminalize protest, we urge you to join us in standing up for racial justice. We need to fight back like our lives depend on it, because they do.
So thank y'all.
Last summer, the killings of...
So again, that's just a short video from the folks who are leading the effort around teaching truth. And we want you all to be able to plug into that. And we will, I will probably follow up with how to plug into the Teach Truth campaign. I can actually drop the toolkit that they have in the chat that folks can use. And so what could you do like right now? Like you're listening to this, you know, one, make your voices heard, meet with your state representatives. The New York State budget is being negotiated. If childcare is something you care about, if the privatization of our public schools is something you care about, if, you know, passing the solutions, not suspensions bill is something you care about, please meet with your state representatives and make sure they hear your voices. May 17th, we already know when the local school board budgets are happening. Vote in your local school board races and vote for your school board budgets. That date, we all know it's a statewide date, essentially, for everywhere outside of the Big Five. But also look at your school board's calendar for upcoming events. They should be having public meetings right now about their local budgets. And then, you know, take action with us on social media. If you are on Facebook, if you're on Twitter, if you're on Instagram, we are at AQE_NY on all of the social medias. Please follow us, stay plugged into the work, or check out our website, aqeny.org, to be plugged into the things that AQE is doing. And so I'll pause there for any additional comments or questions.
So Jasmine, I just, can you send us the specific bill numbers? Because I'm not sure if Gail Volk is still on. Gail, if you're on, please say hello. Gail chairs our advocacy committee. And, you know, we have folks that would want to step in and do some advocacy around some of these bills. So, oh, thank you, Marina. That's great. I appreciated it showing up in the chat room already. So thank you.
Ellen, you're going to be able to save the copy of the chat so we can
Yep.
the stuff later. That would be great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anybody have comments, questions for Jasmine and Marina?
I have a question, but I don't know. It's about the federal money that's only around for a few years. Could that be used for capital funding of buildings?
No.
Expansion?
Some of it was earmarked. Some of it was specifically earmarked for capital, but it wasn't the money that was going to the schools for educational purposes. There was money separate.
Counties had money that they could use for capital projects, but the school money was not earmarked. Keep in mind, Washington was supposed to pass the other infrastructure bill. They were supposed to set aside more money for infrastructure. And we've actually been arguing not to use the existing money for infrastructure right now because the academic needs are so dire and so intense that like we actually should prioritize making sure students' minds and bodies are healthy before we start working on fixing our buildings.
I think that I hear you. I will say that, but I know I spent a bunch of years of my life going to school districts that had horrendous facilities with, you know, things, ceilings crumbling, and it's just unhealthy to be in that kind of an environment. And it does certainly make a difference. But the other piece of it is just that in terms of adequate support for school districts to be able to have more UPK programming because they don't have the facilities, their buildings aren't big enough. And that is the only way to fix that is to build more classrooms and those kinds of things. And we are funding universal.
I would say we agree with you, Gail. I think what we are trying to push back against the narrative that educators so often fall into is trying to do more with less. And it's like, no, let's actually demand that they invest a whole nother pot of money for infrastructure. Like we can't piecemeal this, our response. Right. We can't pull money from the academic supports to now do capital projects. Right. We should just actually fund capital projects. And so I agree. We want that funded, but what we don't want districts to start getting into the habit of doing is accepting that they need to stretch less money to have not as much of an impact as what they really need, and to really name in this moment how great the need is for schools, from the academics to the facilities, and that all of that needs to be met adequately.
I fully support the idea that pupil personnel services, they're always the first to go, they're critical. Nurses, the people who are the supports where the kids go, they'll talk to the cafeteria person, whoever they have the relationship with. And that I think the personnel investment that you're doing is the right one. I just wanted to raise that other point about we want more funding for the pre-K. We desperately want that. We want every kid that's 3 to 5, that there to be adequate funding for it, but understanding that the problems of the schools is that they don't have the facilities to be able to do it. So it's lousy, the money's not used. Okay, I'll be quiet.
No. To that point, because you're absolutely right. We want children to have access to pre-K programs, but pre-K programs do not have to be in the schools. We have a lot of childcare providers, all sorts of childcare providers, right? Home-based programs, center-based programs that are wonderful. And actually more than half of the pre-K money is in the childcare sector because of the problem you're identifying, in addition to other things. But it is a way to invest in the childcare workforce in the childcare sector while providing pre-K as well, because in addition to pre-K, just like in the regular school day, we need, children need aftercare, right? Sometimes before the program starts and sometimes after, or sometimes both. So having availability in programs that can offer all of that and give choices to families, in particular for young children, is really critical. So that's why AQE actually more recently started working on childcare, because investing in both and in the early education part of this is really critical.
And the people who are not school employees in the pre-K programs don't make as much money. And that's
so happy you're naming all of our issues, because that's
I'm about to say pay parity is part of the fight too. Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. I'm not outing myself entirely, am I, Ellen? I'm gonna put myself on.
No, you're telling it like it is. So
I got inside information. That's
yeah.
Can I say something?
Sure.
Actually, I wanted to thank you guys for doing this, but along the lines of pre-K and after school, a lot of people don't truly understand that our young people may not have a meal in the morning. They may not have a meal after school. So without those programs, they're not being nourished, and they may get to school cranky. They may end the day cranky, but how do we wrap our arms around them to get them to get their education if we don't want them in the building? We have to push to get our kids in the building longer. The longer a young person stays on outside of the building, the more potential there is for things to go wrong, so to speak. Yeah. Especially when we're dealing of our kids that have access, or our latchkey kids, where they have access to the house, but nobody's home and nobody's watching them. So if we can get something where they can come to school in the morning with their pre-K programs or their morning programs prior to school, get a good breakfast, get their education, and then stay knowing that they're going to be able to eat again before they go home. I think we changed the district and in the culture in the district by doing so.
Yeah,
absolutely. I'll just name that one of the programs that we've been pushing for state investments is community schools. And a community schools model is unique to each community. It's what does this community need from its school? Thinking about the school building as one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the community. And how do we keep the building open longer, whether it's at night or even into the weekends? We've seen community schools that have like laundromats in the building for kids to wash their clothes. We see community schools that have tech rooms for parents to come in and use the computer if they want to do a job search. The full-fledged community schools often have health centers for students, whether it's to see a doctor, get eyeglasses or a dental visit. The community schools model, and one of the things I will say we noticed in the pandemic, community schools did a much better job of keeping track of their kids and what they needed during the pandemic than any other school. They got their kids laptops and computers first. They stayed in touch with their families because they were already doing it. And the way the community schools model works is it's a bridge between the school and the community. And you don't come in and just say, I'm going to open a community school. You start with what they call a needs assessment survey. You talk to the community about what they want, and then you see what's in the community with resources, and you leverage that in the school. So for example, schools collect forms from students about their home, like what the income level is in the home. So schools can already say which kids are likely struggling with food insecurity, and partnering those families with the local food bank to make sure those kids get sent home on Friday with some sort of food package, right? It is really thinking about how do you literally use the school building and its facilities to meet the needs of children who go to the school and their families. And so I will say New York State at this point is investing way more in community schools than almost any other state. We've been doing a good job. At first, they only existed in New York City. They have been rapidly expanding upstate. Buffalo and Rochester are one of the districts doing a really good job of expanding community schools. We want to see more of it. And we now have actually technical assistance centers, regional technical assistance centers that are there to help schools roll out their community schools plan and to become a better community schools and better serve and meet the needs of their community. And so it's definitely a model we've been uplifting as a way to make sure schools are open longer and really serving the needs of the students and their entire families.
Jasmine, how can we get a needs assessment survey done here in the Utica City School District?
Utica. Just want to say, we're a statewide organization. Utica is one of the places we work. And I'm gonna be honest with you, the Utica School Board is freaking difficult. I'm gonna say one, we need good people to run for school board in Utica. We need to change up.
I'm there. I'm
we
running.
We need to change up. James, if you can drop your contact information in the chat, that'll be really helpful.
I will.
We need to change up the school board in Utica. We work so hard. We try to do, I'm just gonna name one of the examples of a hard time in Utica. We work with NYU and they developed a curriculum scorecard. And we would look at the curriculum at the school. It was a parent-friendly tool to rate your school's curriculum on culturally responsive or culturally destructive. It was a tool for parents to look at the curriculum from a critical lens, and is this the right curriculum we should be using in a district with the majority of students of color? We literally had a curriculum, we called it a scoring party, inside the New York City DOE. Like, school districts were open to having the conversation, even if it made them cringe a little, because oftentimes their curriculums are rated as culturally destructive. We had parents in Utica request the curriculum, what's being used in Utica schools. They were told the curriculum is in the basement. And we were like, what? It was like, what do you use every day in the classroom? It wasn't the summertime, it was like May. And we're like, what's the curriculum you use to teach literacy for third graders? And they were just like, oh, we can't give you that. And it's just like, what? And it was pulling teeth. And then when parents went to the school board meeting, you know what the Utica School Board did? They started meeting in the smallest room possible so that there was no room for parents to come in and be a part of the meeting. It is a constant frustration with that school board. And so, one, we need more people to run and change the dynamic of that. And I think we're also working a flag with NYCLU, New York Civil Liberties Union,
Yes.
around districts like Utica, where all of the seats are at large, because whenever we have at-large districts, it tends to lack diversity in the school board races. And so we definitely need more diversity at that Utica school board. And so why we need people to run, right? Like, you know, things don't get better by sitting on the sidelines. They get better when people and parents engage. And so we need good folks running for school board in Utica.
I dropped my information there for you, Jasmine.
Perfect.
Thank you. Can I respond to the question about the community schools being more diverse? So community schools do not really have much to do with the way with whether or not the community school is a zoned school, a neighborhood school, or a what's it called, a selection school that you choose to go to. It's more about this kind of services that it provides, and typically community schools are neighborhood schools, because they service the community at large, and that oftentimes that means geographical area as well, but it's not always the case. So it's more about that. It's not a magnet school. It's not like a magnet school that is specialized, but any school can be a community school. A magnet school can be a community school as well. A neighborhood school can be a community school. It's about the services that are being combined within the school premises to offer to the students and the families.
Great.
Well, it's 7:06. I want to say thank you so much to Jasmine and Marina for an absolutely chock full, informative presentation. I feel like there were so many things that you talked about that we could have spent an entire hour unpacking. I hope you'll come back again to help us sort of understand this labyrinth of education funding, education decision-making, that, you know, we are all a part of. And if we, you know, education is the foundation. It is the foundation of all of it. And I feel like we have a great opportunity to do it right. And I am so grateful to AQE because you guys are just powerhouses. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And we will be in touch. James, you have Jasmine's information, and you can,
Yes.
and Marina's, so you can connect with each other. And Jasmine and Marina, if you're okay, I think there are a lot of people who would be very interested in the PowerPoint, the slide deck.
Yes.
And then Jasmine and Marina, I would like to follow up with you for some of the bills that might be of interest to the advocacy committee, right, Gail? Yeah, so,
Absolutely.
all right, great. Good night, everybody. Jasmine and Marina, you have to step outside and just for a minute, breathe the warm air because it's beautiful.
I will before my next meeting. I appreciate you all having us. Thank you. It's a busy time of the year, but
Yeah,
thank
it
you.
is.
This is a
Thank
great
you so
conversation.
much. Good night, everybody.
Good
Bye.
night.
Thank you. Good night.